Chapter 22. The Hideout. The darkness of night was upon the group as Cerberus brought the craft to a quiet stop in a screen of brush and adjusted a lever on the craft that lifted the harnesses off the armored rapt horses. Cerberus trilled out several sounds, and the rapt horses quietly ran off into the forest. "Where are they going?" asked Chino. "They will hunt while we scout the hideout," said the tracker as he adjusted his cloak over his shoulders. He gestured at his passengers and brought them over to surround the bandit that was tied up and gagged at the end of the coach. Cerberus addressed the group. "According to our friend here, the hideout and missing wife are up ahead 2 miles. My plan is to sneak up and look things over, then meet back here and discuss a rescue plan with everyone else," the large tracker said. Euclidean was about to ask a question when Cerberus held up his finger. "Before I leave, I have one more thing for our friend." Cerberus drew up a small round object the size of a small stone out of a container on his belt. The smell of chocolate flooded the small area, and Cerberus pulled down the bound man's gag and shoved the chocolate-covered object into the man's mouth, then quickly covered his mouth, forcing the man to swallow the pill. Cerberus pulled away from the bandit, then spoke to him. "You just swallowed poison. It will kill you in 1 hour unless I provide you this antidote." He held up a small phial that held a dark liquid within. "If there are any last-minute traps or guard posts I should be aware of, you should tell me now so that you are more likely to get your antidote," he said to the bound man. The bandit started quietly weeping, then told Cerberus the location of 2 guard posts in the nearby forest. Euclidean looked impressed as he watched the bandit tell Cerberus the locations of the guardhouses. The tracker finished talking with the bandit, then addressed the group once more. "I will need you all to take out any guards at these guardhouses while I scout the main hideout," he said in a grave tone of voice. Janae and Hope looked around at the group of men and saw that each was undisturbed by the direction to kill any guards. Janae was about to speak up when Cerberus said, "It's important we do not set off any alarm at the main hideout so we have a better chance of rescuing Erimus's wife." He showed the location of the guardhouses on his map to the groups, then said, "Meet back here in 2 hours to discuss the next plan of attack to the main structure. If anyone is missing, we will search each of the guardhouses when I return and will not move on until we are all accounted for." The bound bandit began making loud sounds against his gag. "What about the antidote for the bandit?" asked Hope. "There is no antidote, and that wasn't poison but just a chocolate candy," responded Cerberus with a wink. The stunned bandit paused and began making cursing noises behind his gag when Cerberus walked up and struck him behind his head. The bandit fell to one side unconscious. Making sure the bandit was secure, Cerberus pulled his hood over his head and ran off into the forest in the direction of the main hideout as Euclidean divided the remaining members into 2 groups. Chino, Guy, Hope, and Erimus would take the eastern guardhouse, while Euclidean, Janae, and Benny would take the western guardhouse. The 2 groups gathered up their weapons and set out upon their missions. Euclidean looked back and gave his private signal to Chino, who gave his acknowledgement. He and his group slid quietly into the dark forest and were soon lost to sight due to the hidden nature of their cloaks and armor. With a small measure of relief, Euclidean realized he and his group would be similarly hidden from view in the darkness of the night as they quietly set out in the direction of the guardhouse. Following his map, Euclidean and his group soon came to the outskirts of a small hut which was built on heavy stilts that lifted the structure off the ground. The group could see a small ladder that led up to a walled-off platform. Looking out from a screen of bushes, Euclidean saw 2 guards walking a path around the walled area that held burning torches in each of the corners of the fort. He turned to Janae and Benny and outlined a plan. He would sneak up the ladder, give a signal, and coordinate an attack with Janae. After they took out the outer guards, they would deal with any guards left within the fort. Benny would be left at the hiding spot to alert them to any new bandits from outside. Euclidean set out to sneak up to the ladder while Janae moved into a hidden position outside the small fort from where she was to shoot her arrows. The ladder gently creaked as Euclidean made to crawl up it. With quiet movements, he finished the climb and stealthily slid out one of his leaf-shaped short swords. Timing the movements of the guards, he gave the signal to Janae, who launched her missile perfectly to slice into one of the patrolling guards' throats. The man gurgled and fell to the ground. Just as Janae's arrow struck her bandit, Euclidean grabbed the other patrolling bandit around his mouth and stabbed his short sword into the man's side. The sharpened sword met almost no resistance, and the bandit gave a muffled cry as his blood poured out of the great wound Euclidean had caused. He soon went still, and Euclidean quietly lowered him to the ground. Euclidean slid his other short sword out and quietly crept to peer into the structure beyond its outer walls. Within, he could see 2 guards asleep in their bunks, and 2 more guards both playing a game of dice with their backs to him. Euclidean suddenly came up with an idea, then quietly crept away to the outer walls of the fort. He signaled Janae to be ready, then removed a small pouch from his belt. Using one of the burning torches, he lit a fuse which began sparking as it burned along its length toward the pouch. Timing the burning fuse, Euclidean chucked the pouch into the interior of the fort at the last moment. A loud popping noise was heard, and the fort filled with a dark and smelly cloud of soot. Euclidean could hear the men within cursing and coughing as they began to head for the opening that Euclidean covered. The first man exited the door and was met with an arrow into his eye. He fell limp to the ground as the second coughing man pushed out of the building. Euclidean sliced his short sword through the coughing man's throat as he ran by, and the man began gurgling in death throes as his throat was sliced open by the attack. A third coughing man burst outward and was carrying his own sword, which he batted at Euclidean and forced him away from the exit. A fourth coughing man came out behind him and was shot through the chest by Jacen, only for his body to fall over the edge of the railing of the fort onto the forest ground below. Euclidean parried and hacked his short swords at his attacker, who had soot running all over his face. The man swung his sword in a frantic way, and Euclidean could not get in close enough to deliver a killing blow. Just then, a small silver-colored projectile struck the flailing man in the temple, causing him to stagger. Euclidean used the moment to slap the man's sword away and stab him through the chest in a killing blow. The man's body fell limp to the ground, and Euclidean quickly cleaned his blades on the clothing of the fallen man as he caught his breath. The bounty hunter called out to Jacen and noticed the silver projectile that had struck the bandit on the ground. He bent over to pick up the small orb when suddenly he heard Benny giving a cry of alarm. Euclidean strode to the edge of the fort railing and heard thundering hooves. He called out to Jacen and Benny and bid them join him in the fort. The two ran from their hiding places at the tree line and quickly scampered up the ladder to hide within the fort next to Euclidean. They had just entered the interior of the soot-covered fort when 5 riders on raft horses rode up to the outer perimeter. One of the riders called out a coded statement, and Euclidean and Jacen looked at each other unsure what to do. After a moment, the rider called out the coded statement again. When no response came, the riders all quickly rode away in the direction of the main hideout. Euclidean cursed as the riders rode away and said, "Now they'll alert the main hideout, which is what we were trying to avoid. Let's head back to the rendezvous point and meet up with the others." They quickly left the fort and began heading back to the meeting spot. Chino looked at the guardhouse from his vantage point hidden in the forest. The fort was a reinforced cabin with a covered porch and had a nearby pen where 4 raft horses were currently held. As he and his group had arrived, they witnessed 5 riders leaving the small fort on raft horse, and they headed into the forest. Now watching the guardhouse carefully, Chino noticed there was only 1 guard left. He worked out a plan with Guy and told Hope and Erimus to remain hidden and call out if they noticed any trouble. Chino and Guy left their hiding spots and snuck up to the guardhouse. The manservant stealthily moved to the back of the cabin, then drew out one of his short swords and gave Guy the signal. Guy aimed his arrow at the entrance of the cabin fort. After a moment, he released his arrow, causing a loud thunk noise to occur where the arrow stuck. The guard came out to investigate, and Chino crept up behind him. As the guard looked at the arrow, Chino struck him with the flat of the blade sharply across the head. The man staggered, and Chino quickly kicked his legs out from him, causing the man to land heavily onto his back. The bandit was not moving, and Chino put his short swords away and signaled Guy. As Guy walked up to cover the man with a fresh arrow, Chino quickly ripped off the man's tunic and tore it into strips, which he used to tie up the man securely. He slapped the man sharply across the face until he came to. "Where are those 5 riders heading?" Chino asked the man. The bandit did not say anything. Chino pulled out his sword and held it against the bandit's throat as he said, "Last chance!" The bandit still said nothing, and with a grimace of distaste, Chino swiped his blade across the man's throat. The leaf-shaped blade met little resistance as it sliced through the sinew of the man's flesh. A great cut appeared, and the man bled out quickly onto the forest floor. Chino cleaned his blade on the clothing of the dead man, then called the group members together. "We must stick to the plan and meet back up with everyone at the meeting spot. If no one objects, I suggest we head back there now." Erimus swallowed as the bandit bled out onto the ground next to the group, but nodded as Guy scanned the area around them with an arrow notched. Hope looked away from the man as he died. After a moment, the group ran back into the forest in the direction of their meeting spot. Their dark clothing blended into the shadows of the trees and brush that were all around them. Cerberus ran for 2 miles until he arrived at the location of the forest hideout. From his hiding spot in the trees, he could see the structure was very large and was patrolled by many guards around its perimeter. A small stable was erected where several raft horses were penned. From his vantage point, Cerberus noticed the raft horse Barbarus had used to escape was present and silently cursed as he realized the man was there. When he had chased the man down earlier, he had lost him in the forest, but had come upon one of the bandits they had encountered earlier. The man was semi-conscious and had a large gash on his face where he had landed onto a group of stones. He was barely alive, and a grim plan suddenly sprang to mind. Using the pike weapon and a series of quick tourniquets, he had created a ruse that had ended up working at the cost of the dying man's pain. Cerberus took note of the number of guard locations within the fort. He saw one area that looked like a jail and quietly moved in to take a closer look. While avoiding the guards, he snuck up to the outermost jail and quickly looked inside from the outer wall. Several prisoners were chained together with shackles around wrists and ankles, and many of them were women. Finishing his survey, he began to prepare to leave when he noticed 5 riders right up to the perimeter of the large hideout. The 5 riders were challenged and then led into the fortress. Cerberus could just make out the code signal that the riders had used, then grinned as he realized what the next move of their rescue plan would involve. Avoiding the guards again, he quietly snuck out of the jail, then made his way back to the meeting point.
Absolutely not! The risk is too great!
Shouted Erimus. Keep your voice down, my friend. This is the best option to rescue your wife. I personally saw where they kept all the prisoners, and we will have a greater element of surprise against so many from within the fort itself, responded Cerberus in a calm voice. The groups had all reconvened at their meeting point to discuss their plans. Chino had mentioned the 5 riders who had left his guardhouse, to which Euclidean postulated they were the same group that had met at his guardhouse. Cerberus said they were most likely the same group he had seen, and now they were alerted to an attack from us. He suggested a plan that would involve a daring rescue without the need to fight. 5 of the men would dress in the clothing of the bandits, approach the fort, and provide the code he had heard before. They would be led into the fort, where they would stealthily release the prisoners and rescue the wife. The remaining group members would create a diversion outside the fort, creating confusion for them all to escape. As Euclidean considered the plan, he felt a momentary flash of the recklessness he had experienced before, but then reconsidered as Cerberus had come through for them numerous times thus far. Also, he had a hunch the element of surprise would work in their favor, and agreed to go on with his part of the plan. Chino and Guy also agreed and looked at Erimus. Erimus looked at Hope and Janae, then eventually agreed to try out the plan. Janae and Hope looked uncertainly at the others, but also agreed to do their part from outside the fort in the hopes of creating confusion. The group set about to execute the plan. First, they quickly traveled to the guardhouse that had been overtaken by Euclidean, Janae, and Benny. Stripping the dead men out of their clothing, Cerberus, Euclidean, Chino, Erimus, and Benny all put on the bandit costumes over their armor. Benny was much shorter than the rest of the other disguised men, and Euclidean told him to stay near the back of the group when they arrived at the hideout. The group then pushed through the forest to the outskirts of the main hideout, where Janae, Hope, and Guy took up positions for their part of the plan. With their weapons hidden, the 5 costumed men strode up to the entrance to the hideout and were challenged by the guards. Cerberus stepped forward and provided the code he had heard before, and the guards moved away to let the men pass. The 5 men moved with purpose toward the jail section Cerberus had seen before. They passed several other bandits but were unchallenged, and soon the 5 found themselves inside the fort and standing by the jail. Cerberus paused and drew out his pike weapon from within the folds of his costume. The other members all drew out their weapons and guarded the entrance, awaiting the next phase of their plan. Erimus scrambled around the various cells but did not see his wife. "She's not here!" he cried out in a loud voice. Cerberus gave him a sharp look and held his fingers to his lips and quickly glanced into the courtyard of the fort. A bandit had paused and was walking in their direction, pulling out his sword. Just then, several arrows that were lit on fire began flying into the fort from 3 different directions. One of the arrows struck the man who was walking toward them and caught his tunic on fire. He dropped his weapon and began screaming as he flapped his hand against the spreading flames. Other arrows landed on the tops of roofs of the hideout and caught the buildings on fire. Bandits began crying out and trying to put the fires out. As more of the lit arrows came flying in, Cerberus swiped his weapon downward onto the chain holding the shackled prisoners to the jail. The weapon hummed as its blade sliced the chain into pieces which fell to the ground. The prisoners quickly freed themselves and began running into the courtyard, adding to the chaos while they sought escape. "Quickly, let's head into the main building to search for Kira!" cried Erimus, and he rushed forward to stab his spear into the side of a bandit as he pushed towards the main fort. Euclidean cried out, "Erimus, wait!" But he was too late as the farmer rushed into the main building. Cerberus cursed and began to engage the bandits outside the hut. "Go help him!" he cried to Euclidean, Chino, and Benny. The large tracker covertly moved among the bandits amidst the chaos of running prisoners and fire and began killing the bandits with his terrible weapon. The weapon arced out repeatedly and unsuspecting bandits screamed as their limbs were cut away from them by the demon that walked among them. Euclidean, Chino, and Benny left Cerberus to fight alone as they ran into the main building of the hideout. the two fighters cut their way through the bandits they encountered. They did not stop long to engage in a concentrated battle, but worked together to cut a path to Erimus with their deadly leaf-shaped short swords. Their bladed weapons flicked out and cut through flesh and leather armor with little resistance. Benny ran behind Euclidean and Chino and would periodically fling one of his projectiles at an attacking bandit. At one point, he accidentally threw one of the red projectiles. When it landed, a small explosion rocked the group of men it landed next to, and several of them fell to the ground concussed. Benny stopped cold in his run and looked on in amazement at what he had caused. With a grin, he gathered several more of the red-colored projectiles and flung them at various groups of bandits, causing more explosions to occur. He brayed out laughter until Euclidean grabbed him by the scruff and pulled him, shouting, "Come on!" They came upon Erimus, who was wielding his spear weapon against a bandit. His spear cut into the bandit and pushed out through the man's back, causing him to scream and fall to the ground. The spear was torn from Erimus, who picked up the man's fallen short sword and continued to press into the fort. "Erimus, wait for us!" cried Euclidean, and he and Chino rushed up to him. Erimus did not look back at them, and he shouted, "I have to find Kira!" The frantic young farmer pushed past Euclidean to move into the large hideout interior. The group of rescuers ran through a dark hallway and out into a large meeting hall that was hidden with shadows. Just then, several torches were brought out, and the running men saw several guards surrounding the bandit leader Barbarous, who sat on a dais. Kira was chained to it and sat on a small stool next to the bandit leader. The poor woman was bruised and appeared too weak to stand as she weakly leaned against the large cushioned chair the bandit leader sat upon. The leader's wounded hand had been heavily bandaged, and he held a dagger in his good hand within striking distance of the poor woman. "Kill them!" cried Barbarous to his men. The bandits guarding the leader began advancing toward the men. They began pulling out various short swords or daggers with clear intent. "Kira!" cried Erimus, and he ran directly at Barbarous and the guards. Euclidean cursed as he ran behind the farmer, and Chino followed. Benny watched as the three men ran at the guards, but he stayed back away from the fighting and grabbed a handful of his projectiles. Soon, the three men were engaging the guards that surrounded Barbarous. The interior of the hideout was filled with the sound of fighting as Erimus, Euclidean, and Chino began using their various weapons against the guards. Euclidean and Chino each engaged the closest bandit to them, and their short swords swept out to slice deep cuts into the men, who fell back screaming in pain or cursed as their weapons were cut away from their hands. Erimus used his borrowed sword and swung it in rage at the bandit he faced. Leaving several areas of his body unprotected, the bandit sliced a dagger at him, and the farmer was shallowly cut on his torso several times, but did not stop in his pursuit, and soon plunged his sword into the attacking man, who screamed and fell. A silver projectile flung out and struck another of the bandits, causing him to stagger. Euclidean and Chino simultaneously stabbed a short sword through the man, who fell with a groan. Their weapons exited his body in a bloody spray, and the two bounty hunters continued to fight the remaining bandits around them. Barbarous threw down the dagger he carried and jumped down from the dais to pick up a sword from the ground. Using his only good hand, he began hacking at Erimus with the weapon, who was pushed back by the attacking bandit leader. Erimus furiously blocked the leader's sword thrusts, which were made clumsy by using his uninjured hand. This is what most likely saved the farmer from certain death. Euclidean and Chino soon backed the remaining opponents into a corner, and the final three bandits threw down their weapons and bolted for the exit. Euclidean turned away from the running men to see Erimus fighting off Barbarous and was about to step in to help when suddenly a yellow-colored projectile thrown by Benny struck Barbarous in the face. A small puff of yellow smoke popped around the bandit leader's face, causing him to cough and retch. Erimus used the distraction and rammed his borrowed sword into Barbarous, who screamed and grabbed the sword blade within his stomach as he fell to the ground. The sword was pulled from the farmer's hands as the large man fell to the floor. Erimus pulled a large key away from the fallen bandit leader, then jumped over him and ran up to his chained wife. He quickly unlocked the shackles away from her and held her to him. The beaten and abused woman fell weakly into his arms and whispered, "Erimus?" Tears coursed down the farmer's face as he held his wife to him. "My love, I have found you," whispered the weeping man in a tender voice. Euclidean watched the man embrace his wife, then turned to Chino and Benny. Just then he cried out and pointed at Barbarous, who was standing and pulling the sword away from his body. Blood ran from his mouth as he staggered over to Erimus. Erimus looked up to see the bandit leader bringing the sword down upon him. The farmer quickly bent over his wife's body in protection as the bandit leader drove the sword deep into his side and into the woman's chest beneath him. Erimus screamed out, "No!" as the blade pierced through him and into his wife. Euclidean and Chino both ran up to the bandit with weapons drawn. Chino stabbed the bandit deep into his side and leapt back as Euclidean swept his blade through the bandit's neck. The bandit was cleanly decapitated, with his head rolling to the floor and his remains falling to spill out a bloody pool. Euclidean approached the dying farmer, who held his wife to him as the sword remained inside of him. His blood flowed out to mix with that of his wife's, who lay underneath him. "I'm so sorry, my love," whispered the farmer as he held her to him. The woman made a small noise, then passed away, not to breathe again. Erimus held his dead wife to him a moment longer. Then he placed his hands on the sword in his side and pulled away from his dead wife. The farmer groaned in pain as the bladed weapon that pierced his side pulled out of his wife's deceased form. Erimus staggered, and Euclidean quickly sheathed his short swords, then grabbed Erimus as the farmer began to fall. Chino ran forward to help as a lump began forming in his throat at the expression of love he had witnessed before the wife's death. The two men supported Erimus and began to walk him out of the grim room. Euclidean called out for Benny to grab Erimus's spear, and the young man ran forward and hesitantly pulled it from the bandit who had been stabbed. Together they all exited the building, leaving a room full of dead bodies behind them. After many bandits had been cut down, Cerberus began to lose count of how many he had killed, as many began to pour around him from all corners of the fort. The hideout was quickly becoming engulfed in flame, and most of the bandits began to run into the forest to escape the inferno. Cerberus now faced 6 hardened bandits who had refused to flee. They came at him, each taking a turn to stab at him. Cerberus used the special poleaxe weapon with deadly intent, slicing back at his attackers and keeping them at bay. The weapon hummed with an electrical sound as it sliced through the air at the attacking men. Just then, Euclidean and Chino ran up and began engaging several of the bandits. Working together, Cerberus, Euclidean, and Chino fought the remaining bandits until one by one, the men were killed. Benny stayed with Erimus, who was leaning against a section of wall, and weakly watched the fighting. His face was a gray color as blood from his wound continued to flow from his side where the sword remained. Cerberus took a knee on the ground and panted with exertion. He was exhausted from the battle and quickly signaled for them to flee the burning wreck around them. Gathering up the wounded Erimus, Cerberus, Euclidean, Chino, and Benny ran from the burning hideout and out into the forest, where they soon met up with their companions. The large main structure was soon engulfed in flame. Hope dropped her bow and ran up to help support her father, who winced as he sat down upon the ground. The bandit leader's blade was still lodged in his side. The girl ripped a piece of clothing into a bandage and applied it around her father's wound. "Father, where is Mother?" asked Hope. Erimus did not say anything, and Euclidean stepped up to the girl and took her shoulders into his hands. Speaking quietly, he explained how her mother had died in the rescue attempt and how Erimus had found her, but that her mother had been killed by the bandit leader. "Your father is the bravest man I've ever met," Euclidean told Hope, who was crying into her hands. Chino stepped forward and gathered the crying girl to him and led her to sit down near her father. As the large hideout burned on fire, the morning sun broke through the canopy of branches, and soon the exhausted group rallied and worked their way back to Cerberus's hidden craft. The travelers climbed aboard and found seats as Cerberus called out a series of trills, causing his armored rapt horses to come running from the forest and to stand in position to be attached to their harnesses. Once they were reattached, Cerberus directed the creatures to pull the craft toward the path to the main road. The pale and weakened Erimus was laying upon his uninjured side within the craft, as everyone else sat in an exhausted manner. As the craft slid silently along, Cerberus suddenly cried out, "Now what?" and the group looked up to see 2 men standing on the road. Cerberus was just about to release the rapt horses for an attack when Jacen shouted, "Jacen!" Euclidean stood up and looked out to see the lost companion waving at them. He immediately noticed the tension that seemed to always plague the fighter had disappeared, and then noticed the man's companion and how Jacen hovered protectively near the newcomer. The craft slid to a quiet stop, and Jacen jumped out of the craft and ran over to Jacen to take him into a warm embrace. Jacen hugged her back with a smile, and as she pulled away, she asked him, "What's wrong?" Jacen looked at her for a moment, then pulled back and presented the new man with him and said, "Everyone, this is Darstad." Darstad stepped forward wearing his borrowed tunic from the supplies Jacen had taken. Just then Euclidean recognized the man as the Black Warrior commander who had attacked them from earlier. The large fighter drew out his short swords and cried, "This is the Dark Warrior who tried to kill us!" Euclidean moved in to strike Darstad, but Jacen stepped in front of him and said, "Wait, you don't understand!" Euclidean made to attack Darstad, and Jacen blocked his attack and punched Euclidean in the chest with the side of his borrowed weapon. The movement caused the large fighter to stagger backwards several feet. Chino drew out his short swords, and Cerberus brought up his poleaxe. Suddenly, Janae shouted,
Stop at once!
Everyone paused in their movements at the sudden outburst. Janae addressed the tense group. If the man is with Jacen, then there is reason to listen to him. Jacen looked at Janae with a look of thanks on his expression, then addressed the group. My friends, Darstad and I have helped each other survive these last few days. Much has occurred. We owe each other our lives, and he has made the choice to come with me and leave the Dark Lord's service.
I will never trust you, Black Warrior scum!
Cried Guy, then strode away from the group heading into the forest.
Guy, wait!
Called out Janae, but the man continued to walk and was soon lost to view in the covering of trees.